Welcome to Ouch. Was that a ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome back to Ouch, Was That a Ghost? Today I have Jonathan Phoenix joining me from Let Me Tell You a Story. Do you want to tell us anything about your podcast?
Yes, I am Jonathan Phoenix, the Carolina storyteller, the host of Let Me Tell You a Story on Spotify, YouTube, wherever you want to find it. And Let Me Tell You a Story, basically, I tell stories. That's what I do. I'm an author as well. I've got 2 books published right now. My friends used to love when I'd sit around and just tell stories. So they were all like, hey, man, you should just do that. And so I started a podcast telling stories, and I would just happen to be that it just fell in line that they were mostly paranormal stories and legends because I grew up in the South.
You have the perfect voice for this.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I hear that I've got a great voice for radio and the face to match it.
Stop. The first time I heard you telling a story, it made me think of when I was in middle school reading one of those what was that? Scary stories to tell in the dark.
Oh,
it just
yeah,
made
those
me
are great.
feel so nostalgic. Like the way you tell stories is so fantastic. It's like there aren't storytellers like you anymore.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I grasped into it so much is because the art of storytelling, and it really is an art, it's something that you can have a lot of fun with, but you've got to be animated with it. You kind of have to get into the story a little bit. And it's just, I grew up around these stories being told, and I think some of the storytellers that I lived around were probably some of the best in the world, maybe. But I grew up hearing them and seeing how they did it, and so I took it on. And when I told the story to my kids, or to my nieces, or my kids' friends, I would always use that same theatrical presence. And so it just became how I told stories in general. If I was telling somebody about something that happened at the grocery store, that was how I told the stories. And that's why everybody was like, you have to become a storyteller.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to check out your books. You have to send me the links to those.
Oh, yeah, gladly. We've just we're changing publishers on my first book. So it may not be available for a few months because it's being republished under another publisher. I ended my relationship with Olympia Publishers.
What kind of book is it?
My first book, Through the Flames, was it was off of firefighting. I was a firefighter for several years, almost 2 decades. And so I wrote a book kind of about living that life. And it's about a small fire department that has been plagued by an arsonist and what they have to do to survive the situation and kind of remedy everything before their friends and family are basically murdered.
Oh, wow.
And then my second book is, of course, in my genre, horror, and it is called Redcoats. And you've heard my story, The Graveyard, correct?
Yes.
I took The Graveyard and I decided to dial the dial all the way up to 11. And I pulled some other legends together. And the villains in this story, in this horror story, are a group of dead British redcoats that have come back from the grave to seek revenge. But before they can do all that, they have to get rid of the kids that woke them up. And so it's set in 1996 in Georgetown, where I grew up. And yeah, it made my boss go, I don't want to mess with you anymore. You're crazy. He read it and he goes, okay, you need help.
Well, I definitely want to read both of them. They both sound very, very interesting.
I'll make sure I get you the links. I'm sure you'll enjoy them.
Perfect. So what story do you have for me today?
So I've got a really good story for you today. We've talked about this one before. In fact, we've been talking about this one, me and you, for a while. And I've told it before, but I want to share this one with your listeners. I want to talk about the first female serial killer in America by legend, Lavinia Fisher. And of course, I'm actually going to give you the real facts after I give you the story. We're going to get into that. Sound cool?
Perfect. So excited.
All right, so this is actually back in the early 1800s. So America has just won the Revolutionary War. We're just getting established as a country. There's no trains yet. So people are traveling by horse and buggy and carriage. And the King's Highway, which ran from Charleston all the way up the coast, it's known as Highway 17, but it was
Mm-hmm.
originally called the King's Highway, King George's Highway. And it ran all the way up the coast, all the way to, Virginia, New York. It was the main thoroughfare. The problem on the King's Highway was that when you got down to Charleston, there were two big rivers that met in Charleston Harbor. And Charleston was on the other side of these two rivers from the north end of the King's Highway. Now, the King's Highway, of course, ran past Charleston to Savannah to Florida. So you had to cross by ferry.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone coming in would have to end up staying the night somewhere on the north side of Charleston Harbor and then cross in the morning to get to Charleston. And so that's how merchants would make their way in. And so they had these inns stationed going out for miles from the city of Charleston. One in particular was the 6-Mile Wayfarer Inn, Lavinia Fisher. Now, not much is known about Lavinia before she married John, but she was said to be exceedingly beautiful, always dressed to the nines. She always held herself prim and proper, and she would, have that stance of she was high status.
Mm-hmm.
But they were considered some of the kindest and most generous people as far as running their inn. They always did for their neighbors. They always seemed to have extra money to throw around. Blasey, blasey, blasey. And, they ran the 6-Mile Wayfarer Inn, which was 6 miles outside of the city of Charleston. Now, during this time, there began to be a series of disappearances of incoming merchants who were traveling to Charleston. These merchants would be traveling down from wherever. They would be scheduled to arrive in Charleston, and they'd never make it. They'd never be heard from again. Now, the next port of call was Georgetown, which was 60 miles away, and they'd say, yeah, they left Georgetown, they got on the King's Highway, they went straight down, but they'd never get to Charleston. So this became a problem because there are, of course, people in the city of Charleston that were waiting for, various wares, supplies, medicines, you name it. They were waiting for it, and it was never getting to them. So it was causing a lot of friction. Now, the legend about what was happening is interesting. See, while Lavinia and John on the outside seemed to be these gentle and kind people.
Pillars of the community.
Yeah, they're the pillars of the community, as it were. Turns out Lavinia was more of a pillar of the underworld. See, Lavinia had this thing that she would do. Whenever someone came to the 6-Mile Wayfarer Inn, she guarded on them with attention. She would ask them questions. She would be around them and find out everything she could about them. And if they were a particularly wealthy merchant, why, she would offer them her best room and, as a nightcap, a special cup for specially made tea. Now, this tea was supposedly laced with hemlock. You know what hemlock is?
Old-time roofie?
Old-time poison. Hemlock is what Socrates used to kill himself.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's not an old-time roofie. It's an old-time, boom, you're dead.
Mm-hmm. Oh, she used that amount?
Yes. She would poison them before sending them off to bed. It would be here's your night, and be, oh, I'm tired. Well, go on up to bed, get some sleep. And she gave them the specific room that was set up just for them with the tea. They'd pass out, die in their sleep, and then Lavinia would, in the middle of the night, wait outside the room until she heard the sounds of their last breaths, pull a lever which would drop the bed underneath the floor to where she had a pit where all the bodies of her victims were supposedly kept. Down there, her husband John, who, you gotta understand, John wasn't the strongest man. In the legend, John is very much a sniveling Igor type. Now, granted, he didn't have the hunch or anything, but he was not the type of person that was take charge, I'm sure you've met these kind of guys before. You know who I'm talking about,
Oh, yeah, definitely. Lavinia ran that house.
Yeah, Lavinia ran the house with an iron fist. So John would, of course, be down there doing all the dirty work, getting all of the goods out of the pockets, finding all the money, everything that he could. He did the cleanup. Lavinia did the deed.
And people probably traveled with everything they owned.
Yes. So, that's just why this is where their riches supposedly came from. It wasn't from the pittance that they charged to stay in a room at their nice inn. No. They weren't making money from that. They had low rates because they were robbing the merchants on the back end. Sure, every once in a while a regular customer would come through and they'd stay and they'd just leave going, how gracious and wonderful it was to stay with Lavinia and John Fisher, the 6-Mile Wayfarer Inn. It was such a wonderful time.
They had to
You
keep
know,
their Yelp reviews up.
yeah, their Yelp reviews had to have been great. Um,
Hmm.
so, as I said, this was causing problems for the city of Charleston. Now, remember, the city of Charleston would have been the capital of the South had it not been for the terminus station that was built in Atlanta when the railroad came. Charleston was one of the biggest ports. It's one of the oldest cities in America. So, this place was bustling at this time. It was close to a New York City if you were to do a comparison of this time. It was on par
Hmm.
with all these major cities. Now, granted, over the past 150 years, its growth has stunted, but it was still one of the most important ports. Remember, two wars start in the Charleston Harbor, the Revolutionary and the Civil War, simply because of how important that harbor really is geographically at the time. So
Hmm.
people were getting pissed. So eventually, they all rally together and they decide that they are going to go out and they are going to go to every single inn and find out what's going on. So a group of vigilantes gather together. It's the grab your torch and pitchfork boys. We're going to go hunt the monster. And they go across the Charleston Harbor and start marching their way north, going to every inn along the way. And understand, these things are maybe half a mile apart. They're there. They're stopping at
Hmm.
every single one. And as they stop at them, they kind of go, look, you're going to let us go in, we're going to search, or we're going to burn your house down. And so a lot of people are just like, look, no, 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 don't do it. Well, then they get to the 5 Mile Inn. This is the closest one to John and Lavinia Fisher's. And apparently the owner was a friend of John and Lavinia. Well, they get there and these guys are like, no, you're not coming in here. You are not coming in here. You can go away. We're not letting you into our home. And so, true to their word, they lit the place on fire and burnt it to the
Damn.
ground. But not before the people inside were able to escape out the back and run. And they ran to John and Lavinia. So they tell John and Lavinia what's going on. And of course, the vigilante mob shows up at John and Lavinia's 6 Mile Wayfair Inn. And they're like, we demand you let us in. And Lavinia goes, of course, my home is open to you. Can I get you some refreshments? Can I do anything for you? She just,
Hmm.
John's in the back, like, whatever you need. Yes, yes, please, whatever you need. And Lavania's like, come right on in, please. Check it out. And they come in and they check the house. And the only thing that they thought was weird was that John had been in the middle of slaughtering a cattle instead of getting meat from a butcher. He had a cow back in the back of the building that he was in the middle of slaughtering. He doesn't raise cattle. So it was very weird that he had bought an entire cow to slaughter himself. But that was it. Nothing outside of the ordinary. No signs of anything suspicious. No reason to think that they were doing anything illegal. So the group decides that they're going to head on. Now, of course, traveling 6 miles and attempting to burn down houses takes some time, so it's already nightfall by now. They're already one day into this trip. And as the group is moving on to the next inn, they tell this young man, David Wilson, I believe, or David Smith. He's the youngest out of the group, and they're like, look, you're the youngest. You stay here overnight, and in the morning, we want you to get up and make your way to the magistrate and let them know what we found out so far. We have one inn that we were suspicious of. It doesn't exist anymore. And the Fishers are, of course, great people. Let them know that, That's what we want you to do. So they travel on, and they leave David's whatever his last name is. I can't remember at the moment. I apologize. David there. And he's sitting there and he's thinking he's going to enjoy some hospitality when the two guys from the inn at 5 Miles come walking in with John Fisher. And they proceed to attack this boy. And he's only like 16, 17. He's a young boy. They attack him
Hmm.
and they beat him and he thinks they're going to kill him. And then Lavinia walks in and they stop. And he crawls to her and he pleads, Miss Lavinia, please, they're going to kill me. Stop them. And at this point, Lavinia's whole demeanor breaks. She just gets incensed. She screams and she starts to beat him about the face and starts beating him herself. Of course, she's not the hulking brute that these three other guys is. So while she's scratching his face and slapping him, he jumps out the front window. And takes off running. He gets a little ways before they realize that Lavinia wants them to go chase after him. So John and the two guys, they leave off after David. Now David is running as fast as he can to get to the magistrate because by now, obviously something hoky's going on.
Hmm.
And that leaves Lavinia there by herself. When who should arrive but John Peebles the merchant. Dun, dun, dun. You saying something?
I've never heard this version. Like, can you hear me okay?
I can't tell if I'm hearing or not.
Can you hear me? Check, check. Yeah, my mic's working.
Yeah, now, okay, now I got you back. I think
Okay.
I accidentally
No,
rubbed down on this.
I was saying I've heard a variation of this story about the sheet in the middle, and that she gives to them just enough to disorient them at the table, and they had a sheet that was held behind them, and somebody would sit behind the sheet with an axe.
Yeah, that is one version of the story. It's not the most popular version of the story, but it is actually one version. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because, as I said, John Peebles, this is where the story turns. John Peebles arrives and he's looking for a place to stay for the night. It's, of course, already evening, is late as is. He knows he's missed the ferry. He knows he doesn't have time, so he asks if he can bed down for the night. She offers him a warm plate of dinner and does her thing. She interviews him. Now, John's not around to help her set anything up. The guys that are obviously part of their gang, they're missing in action, running with John to go chase David Smith. So John Peoples is alone with Lavinia, and Lavinia kind of improvises a little bit. She finds out that he is a wealthy merchant, and he's brought a large sum of money to go and make a trade in Charleston for goods that he plans to take back up to somewhere in Virginia. So he's planning to go and buy a whole lot, and so he's carrying a lot of disposable income on him. This piques Lavinia's interest, so very quickly offers him some of her tea. Now,
She is so thoughtful.
Yeah, John Peebles unfortunately doesn't like tea. He's not a fan of it. And so as Lavinia, not being prepared, says she has to rush and prepare his room because she wants him to have the best room in the house. As she leaves the room, John quickly dumps her tea into a potted plant. And when she returns, the glass is empty. He says, "Oh, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm ready to go to bed now." And so she takes him upstairs to this room, and it doesn't look like a lot has been done to the room, you know? It looks like, the bed was just made, but other than that, there's dust on things, and it just doesn't really look like she really did anything. And he starts getting a little suspicious. Things just seem a little weird. Lavinia's the only one in the house. Where's everybody else at? There's, other carts here. What in the world's going on? Because, the two guys' horses was there. David Smith's horse was there. Something just weird. It didn't sit right with him. So instead of sleeping in the bed, he propped himself up in a chair right next to the door.
Smart man.
Mm-hmm. Now, he's not armed, but he opens the bedroom window just in case. To get some fresh air, he thinks, but just in case, he's ready. And in the middle of the night, he hears some noises in the hallway, and he hears an argument. And he can't really make out what's going on, but then he hears some loud clunks and the sound of some kind of machinery or something, and he watches the bed drop from view. And he feels someone fiddling with the door, and he doesn't hang around to find out what's going on. He goes straight for the window, and as he's looking from the window, he sees the shadowy shape of John coming in with an axe, because that's how he hacked up the bodies before he covered them with lye. So he sees John, and that's where the axe, I think, originally came in. Now, John Peebles, of course, leaps out of there, gets on his horse, rides straight for Charleston as fast as his horse can carry him. He arrives in Charleston, where the magistrate is, just at the same time David Smith, who was running on foot the entire time, arrives. They immediately tell their story. They're like, "Look, these people just tried to kill us." Now the magistrate has all the evidence he needs. He assembles a posse. He goes back out there. And when he gets there, he jumps up and he goes, and, he's got his gun drawn, or however they did it back then. And he's like, "Come out or we're going to shoot." And John, being so enamored with Lavinia, stands up and goes, "Don't hurt my wife. I surrender. I surrender." And of course, he was sniveling all the way to the cell. But Lavinia, of course, she came out and she's got her chin up. She's, all prim and proper. And she just kind of walks out and she goes, "I can't possibly know what you're here for." They've got two witnesses. They arrest them. Take him into jail. As they investigate the house, they find this scene of horrors, and they find out that the cow that was being slaughtered was actually stolen. It had been stolen from a farm a few miles down the road.
I thought you were going to say it was a human.
No, it was a cow. It was a cow. It was a stolen cow. So the sheriff decides that this place doesn't need to stand anymore, so he burns the building to the ground. Now Lavinia and John are sitting in jail, and for the longest time, they are appealing their charges. At one point in time, they tried to escape. John and one of his buddies gets out, but Lavinia isn't able to make it out, so John waits there for her and ends up going right back into the old city jail in Charleston.
Damn,
They
what the
get
hell
found.
does she have?
I'm really, really curious by the stories that I've been told because
Yeah,
John
I'm
was
trying to keep
dedicated.
it PG. I don't know what else would make a man act like that for her.
Well, whatever she was doing, John liked it. John liked it so much that he stuck around the entire time and tried to stick up for his wife. But in the trial, they found them both guilty and sentenced them to be hung. They appealed it, and at first they were like, well, you can't kill Lavinia because she's a married woman. And so the judge said, fine, we'll hang John first, then she'll be a widow. So the day came, and they paraded Lavinia and John from the courthouse in the streets, John first. And as he walked, people threw things at him, tomatoes and rocks, and he cried and sniveled as he walked, just, I'm sorry, please, I'm sorry. And as they walked him up and put the noose around his neck, his last words before they hung him were, she made me do it. Fitting, right?
Yes.
Lavinia's walk was an entirely different story. Lavinia strode through the streets, her head held high in her finest dress. If anyone so much as moved, she snatched them a glance, and they said that the look from her eyes froze them with fear. She didn't so much as have a single tomato tossed at her. Everyone was just in silence as she walked, as if she was leading a procession, as if she was a queen. She proudly stepped onto the gallows, and when they put the noose around her neck, a preacher walked up to her to give her rights, and she said, save it, I need no words from you. And she looked out among the crowd assembled and said, if you have any messages for the devil, give them to me, for I shall be meeting with him shortly. And then she stepped off the gallows, hanging herself, robbing the executioner of his job.
Psycho bitch.
It is now said that Lavinia haunts the streets and the old city jail in Charleston, walking in her white dress, her head held high, that steely look still in her eyes. And on nights when you're out there, you can see her. You can feel her presence in the old city jail. And sometimes you can still hear the cries of John Fisher going, it's not my fault. And that is the legend of Lavinia Fisher.
That was really good. It's how you tell the story. You make the story so animated and fun. You're so good at what you do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I really do try. The only problem with the Lavinia Fisher story is that most of that is hogwash. Lavinia and John Fisher did run the 6 Mile Inn, but in all actuality, Lavinia was a very quiet woman. Yes, she was beautiful, but she was not the standout commanding force that they painted her out to be. That was actually John. John was actually the leader of the gang that plagued the city of Charleston shortly before the War of 1812. And in his gang were 2 people that lived at the 5 Mile Inn. They were arrested. And when they were arrested, John did stand up and say, don't harm my wife. He actually surrendered to protect his wife and then gave up his cohorts, hoping to protect his wife. But they were never charged with murder. Do you know what they were charged with?
Stealing the cow? What?
They were charged with highway robbery, which back then was a capital crime and, of course, was considered the death penalty for doing. Highway robbery was worse than murder. So they were hung and executed for highway robbery. And during their incarceration, there was an escape attempt. And during this escape attempt, John did stay because Lavinia could not get out. But John actually tried to find God during this time because he thought that if he found God and he connected with God, that he would be spared on the day of his execution.
Mm-hmm.
So he came up with this long speech about how he was remorseful and sorry for what he did and how God had forgiven him, and he thought the people of Charleston should forgive him too, to which they responded, well, the people of Charleston do forgive you, but the laws of the United States don't, and he was hung. Now, Lavinia thought that she was innocent in all this. She really did claim her innocence until the very end. And it was interesting because she was very apologetic. She was like, John did this, John, it was all John. And honestly, no one ever saw a dark side of Lavinia until the moment her feet hit the steps of the gallows. When she was on the steps of the gallows and they were walking her up, she became incensed. She began spouting blasphemy. She began cursing the crowd for what they were doing to her. And finally, when they put the noose around her neck, she had just had enough. She told the preacher to basically go F off. And then she said the famous line that everybody knows her for, that has struck her as being the most evil woman in the history of America, when she said, "If you have any messages for the devil, give them to me now, for I will be joining him so shortly."
Mm-hmm.
And then she hung herself.
Do you think she actually had any part of the poisoning?
So the thing is that they never proved that there was any poisoning or any murders. They never found the bodies. These are just missing people. So we don't know what happened. The history does not say what happened to these people. There was a writer that came through just after the War of 1812, heard about the story, and embellished upon it with the bodies and the mechanism. The axe got moved around a couple of times in writings of his story, which is why you hear that the axe was in John's hand when he went to kill Peebles. And in other times you hear that the axe was there whenever they were killed in the dining room. It always mixed around because it was all embellishments added to the actual case that turned her from a highway robber into America's first female serial killer. And while there's no evidence to say that she didn't kill all these men, there's no real evidence to say that she did, other than the report of John Peebles saying that he was offered a glass of tea and then he heard them trying to come into his room, and that's when he escaped.
The way that the sheriffs handled it probably ruined all evidence, but that was pretty normal back then, to just like burn down a building or burn down a house just to get rid of it. But maybe if something stood there now, they could go in and actually see if they could pull up any bones or anything.
Yeah, and you know, the weird thing is that wherever this is, no one's ever found any bones since. And, you know, granted, the sheriff destroyed the 6 Mile Inn as kind of a message. We're going to find you and we're going to root you out. It was the message. But back then they didn't have forensics. There was no DNA. No. You know, science wasn't really that big of a thing. We were still very much in a society that was very supernaturally controlled. We were controlled by our supernatural fears and superstitions. So the burning of this place that he thought was evil was actually a cleansing for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that is a really, really good story, though.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I hope that your listeners enjoy it and everybody gets to realize that out there is a ghost in Charleston and her name is Lavinia, but she might have been framed.
So don't come at Jonathan. Okay, Lavinia?
Yeah, I think I'm going to get some t-shirts made that say Lavinia was framed.
You should.
That's going to be one of my first merches is Lavinia was framed t-shirts, because I really think Lavinia may have been framed. And people have been telling her story. That's why she's walking the streets of Charleston, y'all. People have been telling the story, saying she did it, and she knows damn well it was John. And just from a literary perspective, though, this is it's the demonizing of women. It's the same thing as the Salem witch trials and things like that, where the woman has to be the bad guy. They have to take and make this woman into something evil, probably because she was the exact opposite. But there's no proof.
I love lures, though, even if they're real or fake or just based on something small that people elaborate on. I think they're fun.
Oh, this is probably one of my favorite lures, because there are so many questions surrounding it. You can't really go, oh, well, this is BS, or oh, this isn't real. No, you can't do that. And so growing up, listening to this story and then learning the truth about it, and then going, well, wait a minute. You know, all my life, I'm like, oh, yeah, this is America. She's America's first female serial killer. She's actually not listed as a serial killer. Why? Because she was never found guilty of murder. Because they never found any bodies. Was she partnered with a serial killer? Maybe. Was she a serial killer? We don't know. But did she take the rap for it? Absolutely.
What a badass, though. At least, even if she was wrongfully convicted, to just step off like that.
Like, that is like, I'm just saying, that has to be, and I'm going to quote a Dirty South phrase here, but that has to be the most pimp way to end things possible. I mean, I'm just saying, they just freaking, I'm taking myself out. You ain't gonna do it. Like, right at the last minute, just taking it away. The executioner doesn't get to kill her. She kills herself. That was probably, and the fact that Of all the things in the story that I thought I was going to find out weren't real when I went back and started digging in the research, to find out that that is the one thing that has stayed constant. The fact of the matter is they say that she was in this fine dress. She was in just normal clothes. The same thing you'd see any other woman wearing. It wasn't a fine white dress. It wasn't all frilly. It wasn't all fancy. When she died, she was wearing regular clothes that anybody else could be wearing. Anybody on the street, anybody that worked in the street. She didn't look like she was some kind of millionaire princess. She didn't fit the lovely Lavinia that we were all led to believe, but she was still badass enough to step off the gallows after saying something that gangster. That is my story for you.
That was amazing.
I agree. With the story, not with me. I mean, anybody could have told it. I just agree that the story's amazing.
No, it really is good. And I've heard it before, but you tell it better. And you're so factual. I like doing all my stories like that, too, if you don't notice. Like, this is what people think happened, and this is the facts behind it. So maybe it did, maybe it didn't.
That's something I really like about your podcast, is that you do like to get all of the facts out. Because when you're telling a story...
Even though it's kind of a buzzkill.
No, but, the legend is still the legend. Throwing all the facts out just helps you understand how the legend and the story evolved. Somebody came and he was like, well, this isn't a good enough story. I'm going to embellish this a little bit. And embellishments are what make stories so great. I mean, I highly doubt that the myths that we hear about Hercules are completely accurate. There's a lot of embellishment in there, but he probably did do some great things. He was probably a real person that did amazing things, and so on and so forth. You could probably go through mythology all throughout time and find truth to the legend. And that's what I like, is the truth that's in the legend.
This is so off topic, but I love how certain stories in mythology, in like American mythology versus Asian mythology, and you know what I mean? It all has semi the same characters, but a little bit different.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, and it makes sense if you think of it as there are representations of nature, not just nature in the sense that we think of it, but the nature of the human being, the nature of existence. Like Hades being a god of death, and then hell is a god of death, and then there's a different god of death over here and a different god of death over there. We have these are the personifications that people put to it because it fit their culture and their way of life. So are these personifications, are there 100 gods of death out there all hanging out like at the God of Death Club? Or is this just a prime example of how environment shapes culture and society to come up with these amazing stories?
No, I agree.
It's like our modern mythology comic book superheroes, everybody, every place has a different, every artist, Japan has their version of superheroes, and England has their version, and we have our version of superheroes. These are the modern mythological creatures that we create.
I see your Deadpool behind you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He's the modern embodiment of death. Yeah. Well, I mean, he's a perfect, he's a perfect example of that. He's a character that we've created that everybody, identifies with, and it's great.
Like it. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and everyone should definitely go over and check out Jonathan, the Carolina storyteller. Where are you found again? I know I listen to you on Spotify, but I'm sure you're on other platforms.
You can go to thecarolinastoryteller.com or patreon.com/carolinastoryteller. And from the website, you can get to YouTube, Spotify. I'm on Apple Podcast. I'm on Google Podcast. If it hosts the podcast, I'm there. I'm showing up. I'm talking.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Okay. Bye.